First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to Mildura. It's my first trip to Mildura, so it's great to be here, and thank you for everyone at the show as well for doing a really fantastic job. We'll get there with the microphone. Sorry about that, it was a bit loud. So, as Jane pointed out, I'm a freelance wine writer based in the UK. So I'm not a market analyst, but what I did for my talk was to conduct a grassroots survey of UK trade's take on Australian alternative grape varieties. Now, I have to admit, where am I? What is the UK really thinking? I have to admit that we're a bit squeamish about polls in the UK. And I'm sure we're all keeping our fingers crossed a little bit about Mr. Trump and the States as well. So let me share a little bit with you about my demographic. So there were 38 respondents, even though that adds up to 39. I know that, I don't know who it was, decided that they had a foot in both camps. So 38 members of the wine trade, 42% of whom were wine writers, bloggers, educators, all of whom attended 21st Century Vino. I don't know if, I'm sure you'd know about that tasting that Chalmers organised in Melbourne and in London, focused on alternative grape varieties, and especially Italian grape varieties, and 58% of whom are what I call wine trade, so sommeliers, buyers, independent retailers and distributors. So it's not a huge survey, but I would say that my respondents are informed, because 55% of them went to the 21st Century Vino tasting in London last year, so you know they're at least reasonably up to speed on quite a few of the alternative grape varieties that are relatively new. And then there's quite a significant number of key opinion formers who were respondents to my survey as well. So, you know, Jancis, Robinson, Robert Joseph, Walter Speller, who was here a couple of years ago, and some really key importers, well known for specialising in Australian wine. But nonetheless, as I think you'll see, the replies indicate that the fact that Australia has occupied the #1 retail spot in the UK since 2004 doesn't mean to say that we have a great exposure to Australian alternative varieties. It's pretty limited, and of course, it's early days for a lot of those varieties in Australia. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you some threads or themes that emerged from the survey, and sort of big picture, it seemed to me that the replies could be seen as something of a barometer for how the UK trade feels about Australian wine in general. So I think there's some useful extrapolation to be done there. And this being talk and taste, let's use those findings, positive and negative, as a springboard for some discussion, some questions later about Australian alternative varietal wines, very much an emerging category, especially in the UK. So I think there's some leveraging to be done of positive associations which Australian wine has in the UK. And I think there's also some lessons to be learned, some pitfalls that you know, you guys can avoid, and certainly looking at some unhelpful stereotypes that have developed in the UK market about Australian wines. So let's start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. I quote Maria von Trapp from The Sound of Music. But on a more serious note, how about Mr. Socrates? The beginning of wisdom is the definition of terms. So the first question that I asked in my survey was, look, what does alternative mean to you? And is it a case of it's all Greek to me? Well, actually, mostly people were saying not French varieties. And they principally meant, you know, the main ones, Cabernet Shiraz, Merlot, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, obviously, Semillon, Riesling, Sauvignon. But there were some respondents who just took a blanket approach and said no French wines. And I think that just highlights that the term alternative grape varieties is not, you know, completely understood by the UK trade. Bigger picture, what came across from the answers is that people were more focused on what alternative varieties are not, rather than what they are. And I wonder, you know, for me that begs the question, do you need to shape a more positive identity, or perhaps in reality, multiple positive identities for Australian alternative grape varieties to really fix in people's minds in the UK, take them on that, to use that Socrates quote, take them on that road to wisdom about what these alternative grape varieties are and shape it a little bit more for them. So I was sort of thinking about this, and I thought, you know, perhaps that's around origin. Maybe that's, you know, for Campania, from the grapes from Campania, which I think performed incredibly well in the wine show, and what I've seen so far from Australia I've been very impressed with. Maybe they could be the Neapolitans. And what about a varietal focus group? I know there's already in Australia Tempranillo, a group using Neo again. Maybe that's the common theme, I don't know. But just trying to give some shape to what you mean by alternative grape varieties. And you know, you might say, well, it's a bit early for that yet, but anyway, I leave that point there. So perceptions. What was the UK trade's perception about how many alternative grape varieties there are in Australia? And for those who'd attended the 21st Century Vino tasting, I asked them to give their perceptions before that event, because I think that event showed people that there were a lot of Australian alternative grape varieties that people just have not appreciated were in the UK at all. So most respondents were in the 25 to 50 category, so that's about 37% of the survey. Only 32% thought that there were more than 50 different, you know, alternative grape varieties in Australia. So what does that tell us? There's a lot of work to be done to, you know, tell people about the diversity that you have in Australia. And I was having a conversation with Kim earlier in the week and asking about, is there any data on plantings of alternative grape varieties? And that's something that's quite lacking. And I know as a journalist, when I'm wanting to find out about, you know, the trends, there's just sort of other red grapes, other white grapes. So it'd be really helpful from my point of view, and again, just to be able to illustrate the trends and the growth, for there to be some more data about that. So which Australian alternative grape varieties have people tasted? I think I shot through there a bit. Yeah, I did. So white Italian alternative varieties tasted. Well, I think the top ones, certainly the Fiano, reflects the fact that Fiano has been in the market quite a while with, I think, the pioneer of Australian Fiano, I think I'm correct to say, Coriol. Would that be right? Yeah. So they've been represented in the UK for a while, so lots of people in the UK trade would know that wine because they'd see it at, you know, the annual Australian trade tasting, various tastings around the UK. First drop, Matt somewhere here, with Anais. Again, really sort of flied the flag for that grape variety. Yalumbo had a Y series Vermentino. So, but here there's, for me, that slide raises you know, an issue of strength. There's strength in depth, and people have this, you know, quite narrow idea of what the varieties are. So we need to change that. White Iberian alternative varieties tasted. A lot of people said Albarino, but I have to say I reckon most of them were thinking, you know, I'm sorry to mention the Sauvignon word, bleep. I reckon a lot of people had that in mind. But I think what that does reflect, that people were thinking about those two Spanish varieties, Verdejo and Albarino, or as I say in Portugal, Alvarinho. Just fly the flag for Portugal there, very quickly and sneakily. But those unoaked whites are very popular on a lot of wine lists that you'll see in the UK, certainly in London where I live. Those are very typical varieties that you will find by the glass. A lot of establishments are looking for an unoaked white variety that's not Sauvignon Blanc and is not Pinot Grigio. So a lot of opportunities there, and I think you see that reflected in, you know, what people are aware of, because obviously what they're interested in is to a degree going to shape what they've actually tasted, what they've sought out. White French, German alternative varieties tasted. Well, Viognier, obviously Yalumba, been very big at pioneering that. We've seen that in the UK for quite a while. So again, you know, not seeing much of, to my mind, some of the more interesting varieties that are clearly doing some exciting stuff over here. Red Italian alternative varieties tasted. Well, more depth there and more range in terms of what people have tasted, which I think is interesting. So that's a really good sign. I think it's interesting that the most prestigious, well-known Italian varieties, once again, they're at the head of the pack. So Nebbiolo and Sangiovese, again, been reasonably represented in the UK for a while. But again, I think that the fact that there's that range of interest indicates that there is a market who are interested in maybe looking at those varieties and seeking them out. Red Iberian alternative varieties tasted. The two standouts, I would say, are those countries, Portugal's and Spain's lead grape varieties, both varieties which travelled pretty well. So I'm not surprised that those featured so strongly on that particular chart. So there we've got red, French and other alternative varieties, and again, quite traditional, well-known varieties, Rhone, and Bordeaux, bit part players featuring very strongly there. So people are going to have seen those in blends, I think, more than anything. That's why they'll be very familiar with them. Expectations about taste profile. So I've got this word cloud. And in terms of what comes up there, I think that this word cloud illustrates that the new world, old world paradigm is alive and kicking. And I think there's lots to reassure buyers of entry-level wines here and producers of entry-level wines, this idea of relative softness, fruitiness, varietal, so single varietal wines. But we all know that the margins can be perilously low in that sector with consequences for both sustainability and for quality. So I think there's a question there, is this how you want to be perceived? And I think it's important for producers of Australian alternative varietal wines not to fall victim to some of the associated sunshine in a glass stereotypes which have dogged Shiraz and Chardonnay, and which I'm afraid to say still linger, both amongst the trade and consumers in the UK. But look, the good news is forewarned is forearmed. So with alternative grape varieties, you get the chance to tackle that stereotype head on this time around and avoid some of the associated pitfalls with that stereotype. Not least when, as far as I can tell, alternative varieties from Australia have been something of a lightning rod for rather different approaches to winemaking, putting more emphasis on solids, on lees, using techniques which really give it more texture to the wine, and thinking much more about structure, acidity, and tannin. So there's a degree of reinvention which I think you should really shout about, and I think people are really excited and interested about that in the UK, seeing that change. So wines from Australia are not always soft, they're not always simple, and I think with alternative grape varieties, you've got a great opportunity to showcase that. And why not? Why not just take a leaf out of France's book, build the reputation of Australian alternative varieties from the top down. So what I mean is, focused on premium wines, not everyday wines, and especially when plantings and quantities remain relatively small, I think there's a great chance to really exert control over your image, exert control over quality, and maybe thinking about some of those varietal focus groups that I was talking about, like Tempranillo or my Neapolitan, I like that, Neapolitan focus group. Opportunity to shape identity and image as well, and that thinking about that quality focus, thinking about what do we want people to think about these wines. But definitely take a leaf out of France's book and, go from the top down. So having said that, there's also quite a lot of positives about the stereotype, which I think you can leverage too. So respondents generally had high expectations about wines being well made, clean, balanced, expressive. And I thought I just pulled out this quote. Of course, being Australian, they would be bloody good, like Fiano. And another one spoke of varietal character with some Australian flair. Yeah, we like that. So Australia, and the key point, I think it's a really important point, because sometimes we can just talk about the negatives. Australia has a great reputation for delivering well-made wines with great flavour intensity and drinkability. So use that. And I think there's an interesting connection here, especially with grapes which are coming from Europe's warmer south, where naturally they're riper and smoother wines. So I think Australia has a fantastic advantage. And it's something that I've noticed when I'm tasting Nera d'Avola, Negro Amaro, and Australia's bringing that winemaking skill to make fresher, brighter, less rustic examples than I have tasted from Italy. And one of my stars, Aglianico, riper tannins that let the fruit speak with no loss of savoury complexity. So I think Australia can compete really very favourably with European originals when you're thinking about those wines that have some of that warm climate softness and richness. Turning to northern Italian white grapes, which generally speaking have been regarded as a bit neutral in the UK, one importer talked about an Australian anise, which he said it had the floral fragrance that I expected, but it also had much bigger fruit. And he said he preferred that to the Italian varieties. So, that fruitiness is also a positive in some cases. It's a point of difference to your advantage, which you can leverage. So I asked, have you bought any alternative Australian wines? So, there's reasonable take up there, whether it's for business or personally, but 26% had not bought any yet. What about the motivation for buying Australian alternative varieties? I think the first one's interesting. People bought a wine because they were interested in the particular variety. So I think it's really important to understand what varieties are in fashion, being aware of trends, what's doing well on wine lists in the UK, where I think a lot of the Australian alternative varietal wines, especially with that slightly more focus on texture and structure, can perform very well. And as I mentioned before, for a long time, unoaked, aromatic whites are doing incredibly well on wine lists as an alternative to Sauvignon or Pinot Grigio. So forget Sauvignon, what about Albarino, Gruner Veltliner, Fiano, Godello, Vermentino, Verdejo, Assertico, all wine list staples in the UK, by the glass and by the bottle. And for reds, there's a real trend for soft and reasonably light, gluggable, drinkable reds that are adaptable to a variety of foods. So Gamay, Barbera, Sangiovese, Montepulciano, Tempranillo, Mencia, they all really fit with that. So those are definitely varieties to be thinking about and seeing a fit in the marketplace. And if they're reasonably low alcohol, so much the better. That knocks on the head another of the old lingering stereotypes. Natural wines made in amphora. Obviously there's a niche trend on that front. Just look at that second most sort of popular answer is trusted producer. So tried and trusted producer, wow, you guys who've got a great reputation out there, be confident about experimenting because people trust you. And that's, that's invaluable. The third thing, try before you buy opportunity. And I think the importance of trade tastings, 21st century vino really kind of highlighted in the UK alternative varietal wines. Otherwise, I would have to go around Australia Day tasting and really hunt them out here and there and everywhere, which takes a lot of time. So how can you bring a sharper focus to them, which is maybe, I don't know, at the Australia Day tasting, group of you, maybe just one of these focus groups, Neapolitans, I'm not sure, whatever you are, these different focus groups, maybe you all club together and have a table and you, again, just highlight it, pull it out for people, show what you're doing, make sure they see you. What single factor would persuade you to buy or buy more Australian alternative varietal wines? Well, price, quality, top charts, no surprises there, but education is right up there. I'm on the wrong one, actually. Sorry, no. Go back. That's selling. What single factor would persuade you to buy or buy more Australian alternative varietal wines? Well, the first answers are no different from any other wine. Quality, price, availability. I think maybe that tells a bit of a story in that you haven't differentiated enough Australian alternative varieties, so people are really saying USP, those offer a great USP. Because I think that would be higher if people understood there was such a huge range of Australian alternative varieties. So that's about profile, and it's also about having impetus behind those varieties, which of course is related to profile. Enough players in the market to say, look, this is what we're doing, and be shouting about it. And obviously volume is going to impact on that. And then what single factor would help you sell more wines? Well, lower prices, of course, but the second highest thing is trade and consumer education. So again, it comes back to this about creating awareness, and creating awareness is, of course, going to stimulate demand. And I think that last point is interesting. Someone said richness of flavour and body, and I think, just be aware that a lot of, I certainly come across this with consumers. They want some richness, they want body, from Australian wines. They want, that intensity of flavour, and to a degree that's been a bit unfashionable. The pendulum, certainly, with the rise of cool climate wines and their profile, has swung a bit the other way, and with natural wines, quite a lot of wines out there in the market that, are quite austere. But just be aware, people are looking for diversity, and there are certain expectations about Australia, so there is still a market, very much so, for those wines. What about value for money? What did people say? So most people were saying they're pretty expensive. And when you looked at what they were saying when they said pretty expensive, often that was relative to the European originals or relative to Australian mainstream grape varieties. And there was an understanding that that's partly because, people aren't making big quantities at the moment, so that might change. But it's just something to be aware of because, of course, the UK is a very price-sensitive market. Challenges for Australian alternative grape varieties. Well, price, of course, comes up in this word cloud, but by far the biggest challenge cited was unfamiliarity. And I think that broke down into three different aspects of unfamiliarity. So the first one was, what does the grape variety mean? Because, of course, a lot of the European originals, the wines are labelled by region, not by variety. So, people might know about, Chianti, they might, but they don't know it's made from Sangiovese. It's quite shocking, actually, when you look at, consumer research about UK consumers and what they know about varieties. So that's the first thing. Then lack of association of a variety with Australia, so they just didn't know Australia were growing those varieties. And then the pronunciation issue, which we're Anglo-Saxons, we all have that one, don't we? All these funny other countries with funny words and names. But look, what I think Australia's the country to address this lack of familiarity with variety, because I think Australians are very direct, they're really good communicators, and I think, Australia can forge a varietal identity for unfamiliar, non-mainstream grapes. And if you think about Australia's history in the context of wine, Australia has fantastic form for varietal labelling and for building brand loyalty around a variety. So that's something I think you can really leverage. And just a couple of thoughts. Should Australians give their own name to grapes? Shiraz has been a huge success story. Mataro less so. Just throwing it out there. Always focusing on varietal identity, is that a trap? Because regionality is much more associated with premium wines. But is it too early for alternative varieties to start talking about regions? I don't know. I'm just throwing some issues up there. Availability, one of the issues. So not enough wines being seen in the UK. People are interested. Can they buy them? So again, let's all talk together. Let's get some impetus together for showcasing wines. Think about the forums, think about sommeliers in particular. There's a sommelier wine challenge in London every year. Even if you're not entering the wines because they're not on the market here, maybe there's a chance to have a word with the organisers and say, look, we'd love to show you some wines. Can we have a tasting? Can we have a table? Or at the International Wine Challenge or at Decanter? All thoughts. Originals are one of the, it's very hard to see. Maybe it's better on that. But in terms of challenges, the originals, meaning the European wines. What about innovative new blends that you can really make your own? And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the region of Swartland in South Africa. It was once known, in fact not very long ago, it was known as the breadbasket of Australia. It was serious sort of cooperative territory. There was lots and lots of actually wonderful old vine Chenin Blanc, but South Africa's awash with Chenin Blanc. It's the most planted grape variety. Cooperatives, everything going into the same melting pot, no one's seeing quality. And that region has hugely turned itself around in 10 years. There's a Swartland revolution, it's probably been going for about 5 years now, and everybody wants to be there. The press, the trade, from all around the world. Also people from South Africa, so the people who are actually buying and drinking this stuff, and they've managed to create the most incredibly sexy reputation for blends. So don't let anyone tell you that blends, forget it because, consumers just don't understand them or whatever. If you make it sexy enough, if you shout about it enough, then I think you can make some amazing blends, and the market will buy them. And particularly with the white blends from South Africa, from Swartland, Chenin Blanc with Rhone grape varieties, with Grenache Gris, with Viognier, with Roussanne, with Marsanne. So they've made their own blends, and those blends, because there aren't any other benchmarks around the world, wow, A, it's original, it's exciting, it's a USP, B, you can command pretty high prices for them, and they started from the top down, in terms of the styles, in terms of the wines that we're making and the prices. Prejudice I've got in there, and I'm thinking about the stereotypes, but I just want to read one quote. Someone said, there's a skepticism if you are selling based on the grapes, and this is why. They need to be grounded in specific terroir or an origin, origin, not the grape, needs to be the focus of production and marketing.
Who said that?
Oh, and sorry, I meant to say this, going back to original, this is another of my, I'm not a marketeer, but another of my little marketing ideas with, thinking about Swartland and this, sexy Swartland revolution. What about mutiny on the Murray? Change the image of the irrigated regions. I can see a boat and everything, take advantage of the Murray thing. All right, opportunities. So the first thing, diversity. People want to see different things from Australia. It's an opportunity to refresh the Australian offer. And also, if you think about it, and, I was talking with a sommelier, and he said, I'd love to be able to increase Australian listings without repeating the varieties. How many Shiraz can you have on a list? So, yeah, maybe there'd be a lot better representation if there was more diversity. Fashionable. I've talked about that, so I'm going to skip over that one. Novel. But beware with novel, because I think maybe I'm going to come and talk about that a little bit later. But people don't want to see, great varieties just for novelty's sake. And it comes back to that origin and terroir point. Highest potential Australian alternative varieties. It's a bit of a mixed bag, and it's difficult to draw conclusions, especially when you think, we've had a limited exposure. But there's certainly, Fiano, Viognier, Tempranillo, all up there. As I said, they've been in the market for a while as well. So I think that's part of the story here. But when people, when I looked at people's answers and drew out some more general conclusions, if you like, people were really sort of talking about the opportunities for Mediterranean or southern Italian whites, where people saw a genuine mass commercial potential. They saw the benefits of acid retention with those varieties. They were aware of the climate change issues around those varieties, so seeing them as sustainable. But a reservation that people had, and I think this impacts on Nebbiolo, and more northern European grapes. There was a perception that Australian winemakers are less good on expressing nuance in varieties which thrive in long growing seasons. And certainly in the wine show this week, I wasn't on the Nebbiolo tasting panel, but I think that issue came up. For me, it came up with Bordeaux grape varieties, the bit part players, Petit Verdot and Malbec, questioning the balance, and for Tempranillo too. So, she said, with a flourish, here today, gone tomorrow. Will Australian alternative varieties, will they be a fad? Or are they going to stick around for the longer term? Well, I've set some hairs running today, all questions for you. I haven't got any clever answers, I wish I did. And I think my survey raised more questions than answers. And I think what it does demonstrate is that it's early days for Australian alternative varieties in the UK. And I think that's good, because there's time to fine-tune the optimal approach to the market. So on that topic of fine-tuning, here's some thoughts of my own. Well, actually, I think he said it first, but really the point is, there's nothing new under the sun. Australia's early viticulturalists had a vision of Australia as viticulturally and varietally diverse. And I was really interested to learn. I was presenting a masterclass of old vine wines in London last year. And Turkey Flat Butcher's Block Vineyard in the Barossa was originally planted to 72 different red and white grape varieties, and only Shiraz survived. But we see why those early viticulturists had a vision of Australia as viticulturally and varietally diverse, just appreciating this huge diversity of climate, topography, all of the things that add up to terroir. But it didn't happen, did it? It didn't happen, that diversity. And I quite like this quote, throw and carb wisely. And I remember when I was interviewing someone about Australian alternative varieties and why, how come when Dr. A.C. Kelly made this point about this great opportunity for diversity early on, it just didn't happen. And he said, well, I think producers were just throwing spaghetti at a wall, and then things just fizzled out. They were responding to fads. They didn't really know what they were doing. So, of course, things didn't survive. Things didn't thrive. And there was no, lack of cohesion about it. Well, look, there's no need to repeat the mistakes of the past today. What's different today? Winemakers and viticulturists have never been better educated or more travelled. And let's face it, Australian winemakers and viticulturists are some of the best educated around the world. And you've got, the Australian Wine Research Institute, great backup. The other thing, around the world in general, we know so much more about individual grape varieties and clones. And we know so much more about site, terroir, if you will, including homocline matching, different soil types. So there's no excuse for not throwing and carb loading wisely. This is my message. So looking ahead to a sustainable future, surely the focus has to be location, location, location. And this definition is something that Peter Gago from Penfolds was talking about in London a few weeks ago when he was over presenting the Penfolds collection. And he was talking about Australian Chardonnay. And he said, Australian Chardonnay, it was like a weed. Everyone planted it everywhere. And it rather damaged the reputation of Australian Chardonnay. And now Australian Chardonnay, has this fantastic reputation. Everyone in London, all the buyers and the press are so excited about Australian Chardonnay and seeing it as, a fantastic alternative to Burgundy. But that's because they're looking at wines which are all about location, location, location. Wines which have a reason to be grown where they are and really perform where they're grown. So don't let other alternative grape varieties, or any grape varieties, be a weed. Be selective. Be focused on what works on your site and what allows you to build a premium, quality-driven product, something that allows you to build demand for it and to build a sustainable margin. To my mind, this is absolutely key in such a price-driven and highly competitive market as the UK. And if you have that, and you have a point of difference, so much the better for you and brand Australia generally. I believe Australian alternative grape varieties can play a really important role here. So I just want to come back to this point. It has to be a genuine point of difference. And I think this is probably David Gleave, one of the key importers, Master of Wine in the UK. I think it's him that said it, but he said, I want to see that there is some sense of distinction and purpose behind planting the variety that is meaningful in the glass, not just a point of difference on a wine list. I want to see the aromatics in Touriga, Nacional, and I want to see the phenolic grip in Fiano, for example. So, to ditch or not to ditch, not the balloon of Australian wine, but the varieties. Maybe what should you be letting go? What should you be, in this move towards greater selection and not planting for novelty's sake? I think it's really important to do that exercise. New World Order. Just before I came out, I went to an exhibition. I don't know if you've heard of a group of artists, protest artists really, called the Guerrilla Girls. And they're very, rightly, I reckon, angry that women artists are not well represented at all in art galleries around the world. And they sort of looked at art galleries and said, look, why, you're not showing the history of art, you're just preserving the history of wealth and power. Why preserve, the wealth and power of Bordeaux or Burgundy? Why not change that world order and think about your own hierarchy of grape varieties? based on what works really well. You know, be irreverent, be innovative, both things that I know Australia is incredibly good at. You know, make the best Aglianico, make the best Fiano, you know, and put your own Australian distinctive thumbprint on it. So, there we go, celebrate diversity. That's my brave new world, if you like, for Australia, because it's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There are regions in Australia that have been massively selective, and not just because Kate McIntyre is here. Remember, you know, Mornington Peninsula nailed their colours to the mast on Pinot Noir, and after that, Chardonnay. You know, let's be really focused. Let's really go red hot on this variety in this place, and I think that is the key to success and sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you.